they still haven't really figured it out. They still haven't figured out the rock and the hard place that the Fed and the country are between. Because the Fed is going to have to pivot, but inflation is going to run out of control. See, they've got to make a choice. Do they want inflation or do they want economic implosion? Now, ultimately, if they choose inflation, we're going to have an implosion anyway because we're going to have hyperinflation. It just may happen a year later. And, well, that's good enough for the politicians. All they care about is that it doesn't happen now. Because to fight inflation, and there's only one way they're going to fight inflation successfully, which is why they can't do it. They've got to raise interest rates above the rate of inflation. And inflation is what, 8%? Even if it's 6%, they got to get short-term interest rates up to 7%. They're barely at 4%. They got a long way to go. And they've got to have massive cuts to government spending. They're not even considering that. Because right now, the way the government pays for spending is with inflation. Inflation is the stealth tax by which the government pays for everything. In fact, going all the way back to the TARP bailouts, Obamacare, the PPP, how did we get all this government? We didn't get it for free. We paid for it with inflation. They created money to pay for all this stuff. Now, if the government wants to get rid of inflation, they have to get rid of that money. And so they have to run budget surpluses. The Federal Reserve has to be able to withdraw all the liquidity that it's supplied. So we have to have big cuts to government spending. Right now, the government's got to cut Social Security, Medicare, Obamacare, national defense. We have to shrink the amount of money the government is spending. The government has to spend less money next year than it spent last year. In real terms, actual cuts, not reductions in the rate of increases, but actual cuts. That's not happening. So the government's got to choose. Do we want to have a financial crisis and cut government spending and allow bankruptcies and defaults and all these losses, or do we want to have inflation? And that's what they're going to pick. Sure, if they thought they can get rid of inflation without a problem, yes. The public doesn't like inflation, so the politicians wanted to talk tough about inflation. But what they're going to like even less than inflation is when they lose everything they've got, when they have a complete economic implosion, when their savings and investment accounts get wiped out and they lose their jobs. They're not going to like that. Now, of course, that's going to happen eventually anyway. There's no free lunch here. If the government chooses inflation, then inflation is going to wipe everybody out. So everybody's going to get wiped out through deflation when this whole thing collapses and a crisis, or they're going to get wiped out through inflation. But the reason the Fed is going to pick inflation is because that happens later. And of course, as we've seen, they can come up with a scapegoat to blame inflation on somebody else. They never accept responsibility for the inflation they create. So if the Fed keeps hiking rates and everything implodes, well, hey, we did that to ourselves. So you can blame the Fed. Blame the Fed. But if prices just run out of control, well, we could blame OPEC. After all, they just cut production for oil. We could blame Putin. We can blame greedy corporations. We can blame capitalism, speculators. I mean, maybe they'll even try to blame me. Who knows? But they're never going to accept any responsibility for what they did. But what I started talking about when we saw this Lehman-type moment, and remember, I'm familiar with these Lehman moments because I remember when I was short the subprime market and the things that finally happened to get me to realize that, okay, we're about to get paid. Because I knew what to look out for, because I was looking for these signs. The idea that nobody rings a bell, it's not true. They rang the bell. Big Ben went off. People didn't hear it. People still don't understand the disaster that the Federal Reserve has created with this policy. I was very much against QE from the beginning, and people are about to find out why. The Paul Krugmans of the world and all the people on mainstream investment firms who were blindsided by the 2008 financial crisis, who laughed at me on national television when I was warning about that crisis, these are the same people who are oblivious again because they think the Fed solved the problem they didn't understand. I understood the problem. That's why I knew the crisis was coming. And I also knew that the Fed made the problem they created worse. I just didn't know how long it would take